Sorry, I became muted myself. Okay, let's start again. Good day, everyone. On behalf of the organizing committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to ISCOP 2021 virtual edition. I'm Maury Goldsmith, and I'll be moderating the first talk. Just a few general points before we begin. This is a special year, and for obvious reasons, we've put the emphasis on quality rather than quantity, with two outstanding keynote speakers and a great lineup of invited talks by four distinguished Israeli scientists who are among the foremost pioneers of cognitive psychology in Israel. This is in addition, of course, to the very interesting workshop that just ended, several interactive poster sessions, and a special virtual social event this evening, courtesy of brainstorm.il. Each event has its own separate link. If you're here, you apparently got them. But just in case, they're now available also on the conference website, as are some short guides on the special Gather platform that we're using to host the interactive poster sessions. Regarding the format of the talks, including this one, each speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Despite the large group, we hope to allow anyone who wants to ask a question at the end of the talk to do so themselves orally, by raising the virtual hand, just like in a live conference. And I'll give more specific instructions about how to do this later when the time comes. Okay, that's the general comments. It is now my very special pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Asher Koriat. Asher, if you want to move your title slide so we'll see the title of your talk. Asher received a BA in psychology and philosophy and an MA in psychology from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He then went on to UC Berkeley, where he did his doctoral research on creativity and the structure of memory under the supervision of Jack Block, receiving his PhD degree in 1970. After this, Asher returned to Israel to teach at the Hebrew University and ultimately joined the Department of Psychology at the University of Haifa in 1976, where he was a founding member of the Institute of Information Processing and Decision Making, heading the Institute for more than 20 years. Over the years, Asher has been awarded just about every conceivable prize and honor, including the Israel Prize in Psychology, election to the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and presently serves on the Executive Committee of the Israel Science Foundation. As a scientist, Asher's research covers a broad range of topics in cognitive psychology, but he is best known as a world leader in the area of metacognition, contributing influential and groundbreaking studies and theories on topics such as the feeling of knowing, confidence judgments, judgments of learning, the strategic regulation of memory performance, and more. Asher's many articles and chapters have been cited over 19,000 times, 6,000 of these in the past 5 years. On a personal note, it has been my great privilege to have had the opportunity to learn from Asher as both mentor and colleague. Today, Asher will be speaking to us about collective wisdom and metacognitive feelings. Asher, the stage is yours.
1 minute. Okay. Do you hear me? Maury, do you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Fine, go ahead.
Well, welcome everybody. I would like to begin with the traditional Jewish blessing, L'Shana Haba'a, next year in Akko. So today I'm going to talk about collective wisdom and metacognitive feelings. Actually, what I'm going to do is try to connect two lines of research that I've done over the years, and both seem to converge on the idea of collective wisdom. What I mean by collective wisdom is the large store of feelings, of hunches that we carry with us, on which we base our judgments, our hunches, anything. And I think that we have a lot in common in terms of this collective wisdom. I would like to begin with a simple demonstration. Just a second. Here, please look at this display. What you see at the top part are circles that are sticking out. In the bottom part, you see the same circle sticking in. Watch the upper part. Now, I believe that most of you saw that there was a change. And now those that were sticking sticking out are now sticking in. I'll repeat. Watch the bottom part. Now, what's happening? Actually, this is based on the assumption that light comes from above, but you don't see any light. This assumption is an assumption that we bring with us, and it influences our subjective feeling, our perceptual feeling. So just a second, I'll go back. And in this demonstration, we show that actually it's based on past experience. It's largely out of awareness in the sense that we are not told in school that light comes from above. We simply learn it through experience. It influences our perception through unconscious inference that is fast and automatic. We open our eyes and that's what we see. We are not aware at all of the process. And it affects sheer subjective experience. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, because metacognitive feelings are usually based on also on some inferential processes and that give rise to a sheer subjective feeling. I would like to begin with some work that I did very early, and please bear with me. I had to dig into the archaeology of my work to uncover that research. I asked subject the following question, you are all familiar with it. There are languages that has names for different shapes, which is Takete and which is Maluma. And of course, everybody agrees on the correct mapping. And now I asked people also to explain to me why. And what I was surprised to find is that people have different reasons. For example, one person said, if these two objects were to roll on the floor, one of them will make the noise mala 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 ma, and the other one will make the noise taka taka taka, and so on. But others gave all kinds of reasons and all converged on the same decision. In fact, when sometimes I told people, no, you are wrong, it's the other way around. The usual response was, come on, that's not possible. People were completely confident that this should be the case. This is Maluma and this is Takete. Now, these are nonsense syllables and nonsense figures, but I try to see whether something like that takes a place with natural languages. When I was in Berkeley, it was possible to find enough people who haven't heard about Hebrew, didn't know Hebrew. So I presented them with the following question. These are Hebrew letters. One of them is D, the other is R, which is which? Now, you won't be surprised to discover that most people agreed on the correct answer. And the same with N and L. And of course, if you look at L and Lamed, they are not similar visually. The instructions were try to get the feel of the sound. And people that did quite well. And in fact, I discovered that I have an old copy of the study. Look, that's how we did our experiments at that time. When I checked the results, they seem to be quite interesting. So I moved on to Chinese, and all I did was to ask people to map Chinese characters on Hebrew antonyms, and the antonyms were strong, weak, heavy, light, good, bad, you know. And when you look at the symbols, they are all complex, I mean, nothing clear. Nevertheless, Hebrew-speaking subject did quite well, significantly well in guessing the meaning of these symbols. I went on to another series of studies in which I used vowels. And we can see that the E is usually symbolizes something small. O symbolizes something large. And there is a dimension that goes from E to E to A to U and O. And the same thing holds true with regard to bright and dark. E is bright, O is dark. And the same is hard, E is hard, O is soft. Now notice that we usually don't associate small with bright and large with dark. But nevertheless, as far as the vowels are concerned, what has been found in studies that used nonsense syllables that included E, A, and so on. Now, I picked two writing systems, the vowels in these systems, and I tried to have people judge the symbolic quality of these symbols. And the instructions were as follows. There are languages in which the magnitude of an object is designated by certain signs. One sign indicates tiny, another small, another big, and so on. So I had the subjects focus their attention to the symbolic meaning of the signs. And what happened, what you expect is the following. Just a second. 1 minute. With 5 people did the pair comparison. So they were presented with all the pairs and had to judge which is larger. With 5 symbols, you have actually 10 pair comparisons, 10 possibilities of pair comparisons. And since we have 3 dimensions and 2 languages, altogether we have 60 predictions. And now you can see the results. All the proportions in the upper part of the diagonal should exceed the 0.50. And as you can see, all 60 predictions were in the correct direction. And some 41 or so of them were significant. Quite impressive. I went on to another study and I tried to use 33 scripts, again, representing only vowels. You can see that for some of them, there are only 4 vowels. And all what the subject did was simply to rank order the vowels in terms, the vowel signs in terms of magnitude. And this paper was accepted in Cognition, but I decided to withdraw it because of some silly thing. It was ridiculous to do it, but I'll read only the abstract. And the abstract is this: 33 scripts represented 8 main branches of writing systems. The predicted order of magnitude symbolism was significant for all but 1 script and was equally strong for scripts of different branches and different historical periods. The results suggest that the invention and/or evolution of orthographic signs have been in accord with cross-culturally consistent phonetic and figural symbolism. Now, these results are really quite impressive, and they suggest that people can somehow can predict something that is really cross-cultural, that exists in some other culture. Of course, in order to get these results, people have to agree with one another. There must be some degree of consensus across all people. And I'll come back to this topic, but I want to move to the other line of research that I've been doing, which involves intuitive feelings in metacognition. I was interested in the question of how do we know that we know? At the beginning, I was interested in this question because people who are creative, when they describe their thought processes, they keep stressing the importance of intuition. The idea that they can tell when they are on the right track or on the wrong track, and in fact, they can know whether they are close to the solution or they are far away. And it happened to me that this is also occurs on a miniature scale in the feeling of knowing. When we try to retrieve a piece of information from memory and we are blocked and we feel that it's almost emerging into consciousness. So we can predict whether we know it, whether we do not know it. And the question is, how do people know that they know before they get the answer? And I decided to study this process, hoping that it will give some information about the connection between unconscious processes and conscious processes, because that's the way unconscious processes communicate themselves to consciousness. They communicate themselves in a feeling that is empty of content. You just feel that you know, and that's it. Sometimes you can get partial information about the word that you are looking for. We decided to run the experiment using the original stimuli that were used by Brown and McNeil in their original study. What they did was to present people with questions like this and to ask people to try to recall the name. You have the definition on the right side, and then the name, the correct name, is on the left side. And what they did, people either knew the answer. If not, they asked them whether they feel that the answer is on the tip of their tongue. And in that case, people were asked, subjects were asked to provide partial information about the missing word, the elusive word. They had to report, for example, the number of syllables, the first letter, the last letter, and so on. And finally, people were asked to say, the experimenter read aloud the correct word, and they had to say whether this was indeed the word that they had been looking for. And the general findings were that people were able to guess some parts of the word that they could not recall. Now, when I asked Roger Brown to send me the entire list of words, and that's what we did. Also, we ran it on English-speaking subjects, but I noticed something that seemed to me quite strange. As you see in the bottom, he said, words especially effective for eliciting thought in original study. And in fact, some of them were marked. Now, I thought that something is wrong. What is going on here? For me, the tip of the tongue situation is something very idiosyncratic. It depends on the way you have stored information in your memory. It differs from one person to another, but what this person is telling me, what Roger Brown is telling me, it's something that is quite consistent across people. The same items that elicit the tip of the tongue in one person elicit the tip of the tongue in the other person. This is ridiculous. It's as if this is the characteristic of the item. So if that's the case, you can learn a great deal about the tip of the tongue from studying the property of items that elicit a tip of the tongue. And that's what we did, among other things. So we studied the reliability of the tip of the tongue across questions, across different questions. The reliability was 0.62. This is very high, which means that there is a lot of consistency across people in something that it looks quite idiosyncratic. We went on and calculated the correlations between items in the tendency to elicit different what we called memory states. And there were quite a few memory states. There is a state in which you know the answer and the answer is correct, no, and it's incorrect, tip of the tongue, and then in the middle you say, I got it, and the answer is correct, got it, incorrect, and so on. So we simply correlated the different items in terms of the likelihood of eliciting different types of states, and then submitted the results to what we called SSA. This simply tells that those that elicit tip of the tongue intended also get tip of the tongue, got it correct, and so on. It's the distance between them. And what is quite interesting, we ran the analysis on half of the subjects and on the other half, and there is a great deal of consistency across people. And what you see here is that there are two dimensions. One of them is actual knowing, the other is a feeling of knowing. So for example, here you have incorrect, incorrect, incorrect. Here you have correct, intended, correct, correct. So that's the dimension of knowing, the degree to which the definition leads you to go to move in the direction of the correct knowledge. The other one is don't know, don't know, don't know versus either tip of the tongue or knowing. Now, this is quite surprising because it seems that there are items that elicit a feeling of knowing regardless of whether you are right or wrong. And when you study the nature of these items, you find that by and large, the items that elicit the tip of the tongue are those that bring to mind a lot of information. It doesn't matter whether the information is clear, is correct or wrong. And this brought us to the idea that the feeling of knowing depends on what I call accessibility, the accessibility of any knowledge. Any cue that comes to mind gives you the feeling that you know the answer. We also continued by doing 1 minute, by trying to see what people know when they say that they do not know. So we force people to guess, even in those cases where they say, I have no idea. And the finding is people knew. They were able to guess all kinds of things. How many syllables are in the word? What is the first letter? What is the last letter? Excuse me, based on statistical information. We know a great deal about the world around us. And this is, again, brings me to the idea of collective wisdom. We know a lot of information. Now, I went on to the feeling of knowing and I ran an experiment testing the accessibility heuristic. And what I did was to present people with nonsense syllables. And what they had to do is try to recall either the entire nonsense syllable or just parts of it. And at the end, they had they had a recognition test in which they had to choose the correct answer out of a few possibilities. And we measured the number of the number of letters that they could recall. And what you see here is that partial information correct, it's here, predicted the feeling of knowing. You see, it's a nice correlation, but so did partial information wrong. So it didn't matter whether the information was correct or wrong. And in fact, if you superimpose one on top of the other, the influence partial information correct and partial information wrong influence the feeling of knowing to the same extent. So the feeling of knowing is not based on accessing the stored information. It's based on some heuristic. The heuristic is the accessibility heuristic, which says that the more partial information I get about the world, the more likely I am to know it. Now, of course, within person, there was a nice correlation between the feeling of knowing and the likelihood of recognizing the item at test. And the question is why? The answer is simple. Both correct partial information and wrong partial information contribute to the feeling of knowing. However, most of the information that we recall tends to be correct. In fact, 90% of the letters that people recalled were correct. So the accessibility heuristic has been tailored to the world we live in, for which most of the information that we recall is correct. But and indeed, that heuristic is quite effective. It's quite useful, despite the fact that here and there we can make some errors. Now I went on to a situation in which you use general information questions. And there it's quite difficult to measure the amount of partial information that people have. how do you do some work when you present questions like, what is the first person who climbed Mount Everest? What is the partial information? How do you measure it? I had the idea that perhaps because people are quite consistent across, as far as inter-item differences are concerned, we can divide items into two groups. Those who produced an answer, they recall their answer. I don't care whether the answer is correct or not. And those who failed to find an answer, but provided a feeling of knowing and then were tested in a recognition memory test. We decided that the items that bring to mind many answers in this group, in the recall group, should produce a high feeling of knowing among those who fail to recall any word. And how can you measure, how can you predict the accuracy of the feeling of knowing? Now we went back to the answer that were produced in this group, and we divided them into two groups. One second. In terms of what we call output-bound accuracy. For example, for this question, a few people reported an answer, but most of the answers they reported were correct. And here, many people reported an answer, but only few of the answers were correct. Now, we divided the items in terms of moderate accessibility and high accessibility, and also in terms of the accuracy of the responses that were given, of the answers that were given, into consensually correct, that is mostly correct answers, or mostly incorrect answer, consensually wrong. I will return back to this division much later, so try to remember it. And what you find, you can see that accessibility among those who reported an answer predicts beautifully the feeling of knowing, and it doesn't matter whether the answer was, whether the item was consensually correct or the item was consensually wrong. What happens to the accuracy of the feeling of knowing? You see, for consensually correct items that are here, the correlation was nice and positive. And for the consensually wrong items, it was negative. The stronger your feeling of knowing, the less likely you are to identify the correct answer among different options. Now, you can see that what is happening here, we can predict from one group of subjects to the other group, and one group produced answer, the other group produced feelings of knowing, because people have a great deal in common in terms of both the total amount of partial information that they produce, and also in terms of the quality of that information. Now, I move now to subjective confidence. As you know, what we do in subjective confidence, we simply present people, say, with two alternative forced choice questions, and we ask them to indicate their confidence in their response. And here I have to go back to the first line of research that I did a long time ago, and we'll start with work on universal phonetic symbolism. There has been many studies that examine the idea that people can guess the meaning of words from languages that they have never heard of. And in fact, many studies indicated that they can do that, at least to some significantly, but not fantastic. Now, all I wanted to do is try to see whether people also can monitor their knowledge. Can they know whether their answer is correct or wrong, even in a situation like this? So what I did was simply to ask people to indicate their confidence on a scale from 1 to 4. 4 means I am probably correct. And what you see is the following. The proportion of correct matching was 58%, which was highly significant. So people were able to guess the meaning of words in 3 foreign languages that they have never heard of. What happens to confidence judgment was the following, which is quite surprising. people were able to tell whether they were right or they were wrong. And in fact, when they said 4, when they indicated 4, they had 66% correct. This is fantastic. I submitted the paper for publication, and just about when I received the proofs, I noticed that something is wrong with this experiment. And what is wrong is simply the fact that because 58% of the answers were correct, then most items are consensually correct. So there is a whole part of the distribution that we do not see. We don't see those items on which people were wrong. So we don't know what confidence people will assign to them. So what I did was simply to run the experiment, to collect more information and try to look for situations in which people's guesses were incorrect. And you see what happens in the original study, in the previous study, was there is a confounding between correctness and consensuality. So when I ran the new experiment, 1976, I divided the items into those that are consensually correct. Most people guess correctly the meaning of the foreign word, consensually wrong, and those which were in between. And the results were quite clear. For consensually correct items, there was a nice correlation between confidence and accuracy. When they were correct, they were much more confident. When they were wrong, in the consensually wrong items, there was a negative correlation. So the story is very different for non-consensual items, just in between, nothing. So the story here is very simple. And as far as I can remember, the editor wrote, well, I have no choice but to accept this paper because it corrects an error that you made in the previous paper, which is strange. But I have to say, this paper, 1976, anticipated the work that I did, actually, that I've been doing in the last few years. How did it happen? So I move now to that work. And that work actually derived from a model that I developed to explain the feeling of knowing itself. And the model is very, very simple. It says the following. Suppose that you have to deliberate between two answers to a general information question. What you do is sample some cues from your memory. You examine the first one, you examine the second one, and finally decide on the, you choose the one, you choose on the basis of the balance of evidence, on the basis of the majority of the cues where they lean to, and your confidence is based simply on self-consistency. If you get 6 out of 7 cues, then you should be quite confident about your choice. Now, what do you do with this model? You cannot do anything unless you add the following assumption, which has to do with collective wisdom. In many domains, people sample their cues from a population of cues that is largely shared by people with the same experience. If you make this assumption, then you can simulate the results. And what happened, what I assumed is that people sample their information from the same population. For example, this guy selects the red one, Of course, there are a minority of people who select the minority option. And the prediction is the following. People who choose the majority option, no matter whether it's correct or wrong, should feel more confident. These are in red here. Than those people who choose the minority option. And the difference between them should increase with the size of the majority. Here, for example, we have 90% chose this one. And so they are much more confident than these people. Now, I will not explain why, because I see that I'm running out of time, but let's see the results. By the way, this should happen also for response speed. Exactly the same thing is predicted for response speed. Now, this is what we get for general information questions. You see, regardless of the accuracy of the response. This is what we get for perceptual comparison questions for another task. This is what you get for geographical questions, which city is more to the north. And in fact, if we don't care about accuracy, we can go to a list of items that have no correct or wrong answer. They don't have a truth value, social beliefs, social attitudes, personal preferences, category membership. These are the results, exactly the same. The same pattern, and again, response speed, the same pattern. And these are the results across 7 experiments, 7 tasks. So they're quite clean and quite similar to the prediction. And everything derives from a simple assumption that people sample their cues from the same population. And the same is for response speed. Now, when we get to this point, this is what we call the prototypical majority effect. We are in conflict with people in social psychology because that's exactly what they have been predicting to result from social conformity pressures. In fact, I won't go over it, but this is what Festinger has been claiming to occur, and these are results that were reported by Basili about response speed. What we have been doing in the last few years is to try to claim that views that are shared with others are expressed with greater confidence and greater fluency, independent of any social influence. And one piece of evidence that supports this claim is the following. Suppose we run an experiment again and again. We present people with the same task 7 times or 5 times, and we simply distinguish between confidence in the frequent response versus confidence in the rare response. You see, we get exactly the same pattern. People are more confident when they choose their frequent response than when they choose their rare response. So essentially what is happening here is what is important is agreement with oneself, not agreement with others. Agreement with others actually is telling us something about agreement with oneself, with self-consistency. Now, we did several experiments that are in social psychology. Actually, they were published in the social psychological journals. And we try to show that there are, I won't describe them, we try to show that there are 2 different processes. There are internally driven prototypical majority effect that derive from the processes underlying decision and confidence versus externally driven. That is like in Ash experiment, the influence of others on your decision. And we find that both of them occur, but the externally driven prototypical majority effect is constrained by the internally driven prototypical majority effect. In fact, when we examine the result of those people, I'll go back to that, of those people who were asked, somebody is, well, okay, of those who, okay, I'll move on, forget it. I got, now, I move quickly to the question of the accuracy of confidence judgments, which is quite important. There is a lot of research on the correlation between confidence and accuracy, and that's usually it's very high. However, most researchers made the following, made the same error that they almost made in 1975. They didn't realize that they are calculating the correlation only across a range of items for which most people are correct. Because whatever you do, people are much more correct than wrong in perceptual judgment, memory judgment, general information judgment, because people have adapted to reality. Therefore, what I did was to try to include enough consensually wrong items. And what you find is that there is a positive correlation only for the consensually correct items and the negative correlation for the consensually wrong items. And the same is true for perceptual judgments. And actually, it's true for 16 different experiments that use different tasks. So the results are very consistent, indicating that people are correct or are able to monitor their knowledge only for those items that are mostly correct, across items that are mostly correct. When they are presented with the information that is incorrect, with consensually wrong items, they are really working against themselves. Look what happens when we use, by the way, this is what happens across all of these tasks. So it's quite generalizable. This is what you get across 5 tasks. So it's quite clean. And I'll go quickly to group decisions. What happens in group decisions? Usually, research indicates that groups are much better than individuals. But I try to see whether this is true in my own experiments. And in fact, what I suggested is to use a maximum confidence slating algorithm in which we simply take we run subjects individually, we pair subjects, we create virtual, we get, I'll repeat, we have 40 subjects, we create 20 pairs of subjects by pairing them just randomly. Then we simply look at the confidence of the two subjects and select the confidence that is higher across the two members of the pair. The idea is that confidence judgments generally discriminate between correct and wrong responses, and group decisions are generally dominated by the more confident member. Therefore, we try to choose the decision that is likely to dominate the joint decision. And when you do that, you realize that actually this algorithm works quite well. The maximum confidence slating algorithm produces results that are more confident than any of the individual members. However, when you run the experiment using consensually wrong items, you get just the opposite. You get a situation in which the joint decision should be less accurate than that of either of the two members. Now, I try to see what happens when people really deliberate with each other, argue with each other, and make a judgment in vivo. So I ran the following experiment, and the question was actually, can group deliberation help mitigate the problems with consensually wrong items? And what we did is the following. What you see in the middle was the individual decision of two members that later collaborated in order to make a joint decision in two tasks. Now, if you take the confidence of these members, you can see that if you count the dummy low confidence subject, of course, this is a poor decision. The decision of the high confidence dummy subject is much better than that of the individual subjects. When you move to consensually wrong items, you get just the opposite. The best decision is the one that collects the low confidence items, the dummy low confidence. The worst is the dummy high confidence. The question is what happens with the joint decisions? And the answer is the following. For the consensually correct items, it really helps, and people do even better than the dummy high confidence individual. What happens for the consensually wrong items? We expect that there will be some improvement, that people will be able to somehow overcome the the problems with consensually wrong items. But what you find, it's even worse. It's worse, it's quite worse even than the dummy high confidence subject. And in fact, it's very bad in comparison to the individual item. So the only thing that you get by having people talk to each other in the case of consensually wrong items is only get things worse. So what happens actually is that confidence-based decisions and group deliberation have the same effect. The effect is convergence on the distributed collective wisdom. Both yield an amplification pattern. They improve accuracy when individual accuracy is better than chance, but impair accuracy when individual accuracy is below chance. So I'll try to summarize what I said. The general idea is that we have a great deal in common in terms of the cues that we are using in making judgments, in making judgment about feelings of knowing, confident judgments, and a lot of things. The problem is that these cues are very subtle, very faint, and it's difficult to measure them. The question is, what can you do with these assumptions? Can it help make any predictions? And what I showed is that you can make quite many good predictions and quite strong predictions, even if you have no idea what these cues are. The only thing you make is the assumption that people share these cues and they sample their cues from that collective wisdom. And what you see is that we produced quite a lot of findings indicating very strong results about the feeling of knowing, about the confident judgments, and about the accuracy of confident judgments. And what we show is that, in fact, some of the heuristics and some of the basis of our judgments, either in feeling of knowing or in confident judgments, are based on some heuristics that are specific to the world we live in. And in fact, philosophers have been arguing about the question whether people are ever able to distinguish between true and false items, whether we are able to tell whether a belief is true or false. But what we show is that, in fact, philosophers are correct. Because if you are a philosopher who wants to know whether people can tell between true and false items, regardless of the structure of the world we live in, for which most of our decisions are correct, regardless of that structure, then we are we have a problem. In fact, I try to plot that. In the world we live in, we are much more confident when we are correct than we are not correct when we are wrong. In the other world that we do not see, we are much more confident in the wrong answer than in the correct answer. So that's it. Thank you very much. I don't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, Asher, for the interesting talk. We now have time for questions. The way it will work, I see, hold on. Okay. The way it will work is people raise their hands. I see some have already raised their hands, and we'll call on you in the order that you raised your hand, and each person, when called upon, will be able to unmute themselves, ask the question, and then we'll continue on. So let's begin. Wait a minute. Okay, our first question is from Niv Regev. Niv, do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Asher. That was fascinating, really. So this raises an important question, right? So if the world we live in is so important, and we know that many people live in different worlds, be it the world, so take a prominent example nowadays, vaccination. Some people live in alternative worlds dominated by alternative facts, and they keep getting exposed to multiple sources of information that are not grounded in objective reality. Or take social backgrounds. Some people live in certain social backgrounds, say high socioeconomic status, they live in one reality, and people with a low socioeconomic background live in a different reality. So the worlds some of the population live in are inherently different. So the question is, how can we bridge that gap? How can we perhaps regulate the effects you show here? How can we transfer people from one state to the other, or dampen the confidence, or what can we do with it?
Are you asking a question about confidence or about social psychology? I mean, the question is, what do we do? You are asking about confidence. Okay.
The bridge, right?
A question that is should be quite interesting is what is the limit of the idea that people have a great deal in common? Obviously, that's not true. Obviously, so far we have not found that limit. And the last thing that we did was to run an experiment using personality questions. And we asked people to say how confident you are. Now, personality questions are used to measure individual differences. Nevertheless, we found a situation in which people who choose the majority option are more confident than those who choose the minority question across items. So there must be some core that people share in common. Of course, the size of the majority-minority difference was not as strong as for general information questions and so on, but nevertheless, it was significant. In order to find the limit, you have to do more work than we have been doing. In one experiment, for example, we measured social attitudes. And the dimension was liberal versus conservative. Now we try to define the majority option in terms of the entire group. It doesn't matter whether you are liberal or conservative. That division did much better than deciding on the majority option on the basis of the liberal or on the basis of the conservative, as if treating them as two different groups, two different populations. It worked much better, it looked much better, as if they have something in common, and that's what influences subjective feelings. But there is a lot of work that is needed there. And of course, I didn't mention it at the end of the work, because the work I started with that I mentioned at the beginning had to do with cross-cultural similarities. But the work I've been doing until now with confidence judgments and so on are all for Israel, all Israeli students, well, some English-speaking subjects. But is there some cultural consistency? Can you predict, between cultures? I don't know. Again, somebody's got to do that. Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Roni Hirschhorn.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for this lovely talk. My question is actually developmental. Do you have any hypotheses or works on when do these heuristics actually develop? Like, when do we experience enough reality to develop these effects that we see in the confidence and judgments?
Well, you are talking about the developmental work, right? we did some work on judgments of learning, and we described the development of some of these heuristics that underlie judgments of learning. But in the case of confidence or feelings of knowing, other people have done some work, and actually it develops quite early. We did some preliminary research. The findings that we find with majority and minority with confidence, you can find them, by the age of about 7 or 8 already. So I don't know how the heuristic develops, but certainly there is need for work, developmental work. By the way, in some of our work in other areas, mostly judgment of learning, we find that some of the things that we see in among adults actually develop only in high school. So they come quite late. Others come very early. So it depends exactly what you are looking for.
Okay. Next questioner, Roy Schulman. Roy, can you unmute? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, my action was just about the difference between this tip of the tongue and feeling of knowledge. Like, do you see them as interchangeable, or it's just like one of them is just an extra feeling of knowledge, or like how do you view the difference between the two?
I'm sorry. Say it again. Repeat.
You referred both to like the feeling of the tip of the tongue, right, the TOT, and to the feeling of knowledge, the FOK. I was just wondering if those two are the same thing, or like they're different in some way. So that's one.
Well, the way they are defined today is a kind of procedural definition. Feeling of knowing studies are usually studies in which people are asked to predict the likelihood that they will remember something, either produce a correct answer to a question that they cannot produce now, or that they can recognize the answer from among several options, whereas the tip of the tongue involves partial knowledge. So the definition is really operational. But of course, the feeling of knowing is involved in the tip of the tongue experience. Usually people who have a feeling, tip of the tongue have also a feeling of knowing. But these two phenomena have been studied, in different areas. By the way, we don't have a tip of, it's quite something that I wrote about, but I don't think that people pay attention to it. We don't have a tip of the tongue about any piece of information. That's not true. We have a tip of the tongue for some special things. For example, I gave the following thing. How old was, I can't remember, Eisenhower when he died? Do you have the information of the tip of your tongue? No. You have a tip of the tongue only on names, on words. There is plenty of information for which you don't have a tip of the tongue about. So the feeling of knowing, however, covers this area too. Anything, any question about anything. Did I get do you understand? I mean, today there are simply two different areas of research, but of course they have to be related. They are related with regard to only some of the questions, some of the areas.
Okay. Next question, Shira, Neve.
Hi, thank you a lot for the lecture. It was fascinating. And I was wondering about the last graph you presented, the difference or the opposites between the wrong and right, and in our world and the other world. And maybe I missed it, but I would like to hear your explanation of why is it opposite, and also why the gap between the wrong and right is not equal in size.
I probably didn't mention it, but the basic idea is that confidence judgments monitor the consensuality of the response, not its accuracy. It simply predicts the likelihood that other people will make the same decision as I did. Now, when we are talking about the situation for which most of the answers are consensually correct, then of course there should be a correlation between confidence and accuracy, because consensuality and accuracy go hand in hand. On the other hand, if we are talking about a situation in which all items are consensually wrong, then there is a separation between consensuality and actually there is a negative correlation between consensuality and accuracy. And in that case, that's what you get. Again, confidence judgments monitor the consensuality of the response, not its accuracy. Therefore, you get a separation between them. This is quite important. People didn't notice that in most of the experiments that have been done, probably in all of the experiments that have calculated the correlation between confidence and accuracy, there was a confounding between consensuality and accuracy. And therefore, they didn't see what they were able to do by adding a simple assumption. Again, I'm trying to emphasize here that people sample their information from the same population of cues.
Okay, thank you very much, Asher, for a very interesting talk. Our next talk will be at 1:30, so we have a short coffee break. See you.
Thank you all. Hi.